Everybody to our final presentation for what's been a very full, very powerful week. Can't put it into words yet myself, really. So I'd like to present to you Kim Hallin, and she's going to talk about just a beautiful story that I'm sure we will treasure hearing. And Kim, thank you for having the courage to share this with us. And with that said, there's not a lot of technical stuff I need to pass over to you guys. We'll come back at the end, like we have been doing, for sharing and questions. And for now, over to you, Kim.
Great. Thank you, Linda. And first of all, I just want to say again, thank you to Linda for putting this amazing virtual conference together. I haven't been to all the sessions this week, but I've been to quite a few, and it's just been amazing, and such an incredible community of people. And if I know Linda, I have a feeling that she's going to be thinking of other ways for us all to stay connected with each other in the future. So I'm excited about that. So Linda, thank you for your vision for this conference. And I'm really honored to be the one that gets to close it out with this story. So let me make sure that my slides are working here. Yeah, so I might need to escape and come back. Hold on. Whoops, now we're going the wrong way. Okay, there we go. I hope they're moving on your end. I know there might be a little bit of a delay, so I'll try to pause in between. But real quickly, for those who may want to know a little more about me, again, my name is Kim Hallin, and I am a solopreneur who left a 20-year career in higher education management and fundraising in 2017 to take a leap of faith and follow my dreams of starting what I call an equine-inspired learning business. My business is called Unbridled, and it's kind of eclectic, but the unifying theme throughout everything I do is that I support both humans and horses in the process of unbridling themselves from both the external expectations of the domestic world and the internal gremlins, if you will, that often prevent all of us from living our most authentic lives and truly sharing our greatest gifts with the world. The tagline for my business, as you can see on the page here, is horses healing humans, healing horses, because I truly believe, as Linda does, that humanity needs the horses and also vice versa. One of the primary goals that Linda had for this conference is that it would be very interactive and experiential despite being virtual. And thanks to the amazing presenters who've led the way this week, I feel like that goal has been met and surpassed with flying colors. So in some ways, it seems a little odd to end a really interactive conference with a session where I'm simply going to be telling a story. And those of you who have joined will mostly be listening until we get to the end and have some question and answer. But those of you who might have been in Graham's presentation on Wednesday, he talked about how storytelling is an experiential experience. And so I think that hopefully that will come true today, that storytelling is an interactive experience. And so I encourage you to just sit back and allow yourself to get drawn into the story that I'm going to tell and to be captivated by the images of my horses. This is my story. It's also Shoki's story. And it's the story of each of the other members of my herd as well. But it could just as easily be your story, because every story is both unique and universal. So I think everybody's turned off their video and muted your microphones, and I'll get to it. Saying goodbye to a loved one, any loved one, is one of the hardest things in the world. And yet death is an inevitable part of life. Eventually, we all experience it, not just personally when it's our time, but at some point during our lives, almost all of us will experience the loss of a loved one. And many of us will experience it more than once. Unfortunately, despite the universal nature and experience of death and of grieving, these aren't topics we talk about very openly in human society. And when we do, rarely does the discussion include an acknowledgement that there's much that's beautiful and sacred about this transition and about the release from an embodied physical form here on Earth. Today, I'm honored to share with you an amazing story about how my small herd of horses, particularly my Arabian gelding Shoki, he's the bay with the long white blaze that's pictured on the left in this group shot, guided me through a life-changing experience of learning how to honor this sacred time of transition. I want to start by acknowledging that the lessons they taught me aren't something I could have learned, at least not in the same way or to the same depth of understanding, just by hearing someone talk about it. What Shoki and my horses guided me through was an experience of learning and knowing by doing and being. That's what experiential learning is. My only hope today is that by sharing some of the actual photographs I captured in real time, I might give you at least a glimpse into what the actual experience was like for me. I hope that some of you or most of you had a chance to read the obituary that Linda sent a link to, and I think she's put it in the comments now too. I wanted you to be able to read this obituary in advance of my presentation for two reasons. The first is that hopefully it gave you at least a general sense that Shoki was not just a horse to me. He was my friend, he was my partner, my teacher, my inspiration, and my soulmate. He was a living reminder for me every day of my friend Billy, who rescued Shoki, and of the trust she demonstrated in me when she asked me to look after him just before she died. Shoki was also the sage and elder of my herd, and he was my right-hand man in my equine-inspired learning business. Everyone whose life Shoki touched adored him, and the hole that his passing has left in our hearts and lives is huge. The writing of his obituary was an important part of the process that Shoki and I went through together as we were saying our goodbyes to one another. It was immensely therapeutic to reflect on our life together and to decide what we both felt was most important to say. Having the opportunity to move through the end-of-life process with Shoki was truly a gift. It revealed for me in a very clear way that there are 6 distinct elements to the process of saying goodbye in a healthy way. I will use these 6 elements to give today's story some structure. And here's what they are. The first is making the decision. The second element is what I call navigating the crossroads. The third is a good death. The fourth is honoring our grief. The fifth is rebirth. And the sixth is a legacy. Depending on the unique situation leading up to any transition between life and death, how we move through each of these 6 elements will vary. But each one is important, and each one is a necessary part of the process. As I tell the story of how Shoki and I walked through these 6 elements, by no means am I implying that our story represents how it should be done. It's just one example of how it was done. My hope is that this story will open your heart and mind to a wide range of possibilities about how you might walk this path in partnership with the loved ones in your life when the time comes. And I also want to say that although I've listed the 6 elements here in a specific order, they won't necessarily always play out in this order. And the truth is, most of them will overlap one another throughout the process, as they did for me and Shoki. The first element I'm going to talk about today is making the decision. And what I'm talking about here is the decision that those of us who are lifetime custodians and caretakers of beloved equine companions must make. And it involves a question I get asked all the time. How do we know when it's time to assist our horses transition? And the answer is this: you will know because your horse will tell you. Our primary responsibility in this decision is simply to listen. And I mean listen to the horse, our friend, our partner. Because there isn't anyone else on earth who can tell us when the time is right. No one knows your horse the way you do. But what I can share with you is something my veterinarian confided to me after we helped Shoki with his transition. She said that most people wait far too long. And I believe this is because we're waiting for a sign that we can't ignore. We're secretly hoping that something will happen that will make the decision for us. or at least that will make the decision easier. But when we take this route of waiting for the decision to be made for us, we miss the opportunity to be present with our horse and with ourselves when it matters most. In Shoki's case, the signs could have been easy to ignore or to miss entirely if I hadn't been actively open to seeing them, or if it wasn't important to me to honor what I knew to be true about this particular horse. Shoki was an extremely proud horse. He was also amazingly soft and gentle. He had a commanding presence, and he was not afraid to step into his power when that's what the moment called for. He was the most sensitive horse I've ever known, and yet he was stoic. He was both skittish and deeply courageous. When it came to protecting the sanctity or safety of his herd, he never missed a beat. The name Shoki, which Billy gave him, means protector of hearth and home, and there couldn't have been a more fitting name for him. A beautiful, graceful Arabian, Shoki was one of those horses who never seemed to age and who somehow still managed to run and play and trot at 31 years old as if he were floating on air. He was both graceful and spirited right up to his final day. But by the beginning of this year, the arthritis and ring bone he suffered from left him limping pretty horribly whenever he forgot his age and overdid it. His day-to-day pain and discomfort had become chronic, even with daily medication. This was one of the signs he gave me. Another way Shoki told me the time was coming was when he started demonstrating symptoms of chronic sleep deprivation. Shoki was a horse who had always gotten his REM sleep in what I call the deer position. He was never a side lier, like what you see his pasture-mate Puck doing in the top center photo here. If I ever saw Shoki lying flat on his side, which thankfully only happened a few times in our 19 years together, I knew it meant he was very sick. Complete relaxation is just not something Shoki embraced naturally or very easily. Unfortunately, as his joint pain advanced, it became uncomfortable for Shoki to keep his leg joints flexed in the bent positions required for lying in that deer position. So over time, at some point, I guess he simply made a decision to stop lying down to sleep. He could easily get up and down, and he would do this to roll. I'd see it pretty much every day. So I knew it wasn't that he couldn't get up and down. But despite my best and most creative efforts, I couldn't convince him to try sleeping on his side with his legs outstretched, which would have probably been more comfortable. And as we all know, lack of sleep is cumulative. And eventually Shoki started experiencing partial collapses when he napped while he was standing, because his body was exhausted and it would start to go into REM sleep even though he wasn't lying down. Obviously, this tendency toward collapse put him at a greater risk of injuring himself or even of unintentionally getting cast under a low fence board at some point. But the most telling sign of all, and the one that ultimately convinced me without a shadow of a doubt that Shoki was telling me it was time, was when the dynamics of the herd took a major shift. Up until that day, Shoki was, in every aspect of these words, the heart and soul and spirit of my little herd. In the beginning, I had a herd of only 2 horses, Shoki and my dun mare named Puck. In 2006, I bred Puck, and in 2007, her red dun filly Tempo became the 3rd member of my herd. These 3 horses were extremely bonded, and even though Shoki was not Tempo's biological father, they were a family unit. He helped to raise Tempo, and from the day she was born, she idolized and adored him. Their relationship was absolutely one of father and daughter. Of these 3 horses, Shoki was the one who had been at my farm the longest. He was also the oldest. These 2 factors alone were probably enough to ensure that he would always be held in high regard by the other 2. But Shoki also just had something else about him that made him special. He was regal and proud and stately and expressive. And yet he was also compassionate. And above all, he carried a very deep sense of responsibility for the well-being of the other two horses and of me. Shoki was the partner of a lifetime for me. I am the horsewoman I am today because he made it his life's purpose to make sure I didn't forget mine. He was my inspiration and my aspiration. Years later, when I started my current business and decided to add 2 more geldings to my healing herd, pig, actually I didn't decide that, the pig just showed up, but it was Shoki's approval I had to get in all of these cases. And the others, the horses and the pig, all knew that his approval was the one they had to win. The first horse I added to my herd was Marcus. Shoki and Marcus had a very turbulent relationship in the beginning. Not only was Marcus the first outside horse I had attempted to integrate into my tight-knit herd of 3, but Marcus was a retired show horse who had never lived in a herd. He was not good at reading the other horse's body language, and he had no idea how to take care of himself in a herd situation. But over time, with a great deal of support and mentoring from both me and the other horses, Tempo in particular, Marcus did learn how to be a horse, and more importantly, how to become a contributing member of the herd. Once he was accepted into the herd, Marcus worked really hard to win Shoki's approval and friendship. And the bond these 2 geldings eventually developed touched my heart to the core. Each, it seemed, filled a monumental gap in the other's emotional and social landscape. Gaps that I don't think either of them even knew existed prior to the beautiful friendship they forged together. Marcus also developed a strong friendship with Rayleigh Cario, who was the other new horse I added to my herd. But the relationship that Rayleigh, that's what I call him for short, Rayleigh and Marcus, their relationship is much more animated than Marcus's relationship with Shoki was. And I think this may be partly because these two geldings were both newbies, and they held a similar low-level ranking in terms of seniority in my herd. So I think that made them feel more comfortable to just be playful and relaxed together. Interestingly, Rayleigh also had a very spunky relationship with Shoki. And Shoki liked Rayleigh from the very beginning, although he did not hesitate to make it very clear where they stood with one another, as the photo on the left indicates. That was taken like in the first couple days that Rayleigh was here. And that was rare. Like I said, they liked each other from the beginning, but when push came to shove, Shoki was going to let him know who was in charge. But unlike Marcus, who was always very respectful of Shoki, Rayleigh is a little horse who takes big pleasure in pushing everyone's buttons and boundaries, including mine sometimes. Still, there was never any question in any of the horses' minds that Shoki held a place and a position all his own on my farm. Until, that is, the day that everything shifted. I honestly couldn't believe my eyes that day when I turned the herd out and suddenly Rayleigh was moving Shoki around the pasture. And it was so obvious to me that Shoki was letting him do it. I couldn't understand why this was happening, and I can't tell you how much it literally hurt my heart to see the horse I'd always assumed would maintain high stature in my herd, letting himself be herded around by this little punk. And that's exactly what Rayleigh was acting like, a kid with newfound powers he had no idea how to use judiciously. But as I continued to observe this dynamic over the next few weeks, it became clear to me what Shoki was doing. He had spent all of his years on my farm modeling for the other horses how to lead with grace. And now he wanted to give them a chance to practice while he was still here. And this is where Shoki taught me about the second element, which I call navigating the crossroads. This is a phrase I actually borrowed from author Linda Kohanov, because it was during the same time period that I first pulled card number 20 from her deck of archetype cards. that go with her book entitled The Way of the Horse. Some of you may be familiar with this book and the beautiful deck of cards that are illustrated by Kim Hallin. Navigating the crossroads is all about the delicate process and balancing act of letting go of something, such as our relationship with someone as we know it, when the time comes for us to start evolving beyond, while still staying present and supportive and connected. For me and Shoki, this not only meant staying present with one another, but also not abandoning our emotional connections with the other members of our herd during this time of transition. How this played out for Shoki was that the shift he initiated in the herd dynamics also involved him spending a lot more time away from the other horses. This may have been partly to give them a chance to experience being together without him, but it also allowed him to avoid being run around by Rayleigh in ways that he really couldn't physically handle anymore. These shifting dynamics with Rayleigh were particularly upsetting to Tempo, who made it very clear that she was not on board with Rayleigh being the one who could suddenly move her father around. And she went out of her way to try to support and defend Shoki, even when he was trying to mentor Rayleigh and to test Rayleigh to see if he had what it might take to move into a more of a leadership role in the herd. There was part of me that also felt that Shoki may have started taking himself out of the mix more often simply because he saw how upset it made Tempo. As for me, I took advantage of the times when Shoki was off by himself to just go sit with him, quiet my mind, and open my heart. I asked him to help me understand what he was doing, and I also asked him to tell me what he was needing from me. During one of these conversations, I specifically asked him for guidance and clarity around the decision. I told him that I could see he was backing out of the herd dynamics and that I recognized he was doing this by choice. What I didn't know was whether this was his way of telling me that he was ready to go. I admitted to him that I was never going to be ready for that myself. But I also reiterated to him the promise I had made a long time ago that I would be here for him when that time came. I also told him that the last thing on earth I wanted was for him to suffer in the end. In the space of silence that followed this question, I just sat there observing him and searching his face for an answer. I admit that at first I was a little frustrated because he didn't seem to be trying to communicate anything to me. But as I watched him, I started to notice that he was shifting his weight ever so slowly and subtly back and forth from one front foot to the other. It was so subtle that I honestly had never noticed it before. But in that moment of stillness and pause, I saw the true extent of his pain. I could tell he was hurting, even just standing at rest. The daily dose of Equiox I'd been giving him for months was no longer enough to keep him comfortable. The tears started rolling down my face at this realization. Okay, I said. Okay. I promised you I would be here for you when this time came, and I will not break that promise. And then, in order to hold myself accountable, I left him, and I went directly inside that moment, and I called my vet to make the appointment. She and I picked a date the following week at a time of day when I knew the neighborhood would be quiet, and early enough that the rest of the herd would have a chance to say their goodbyes before he was buried. She asked a few questions, and I explained to her how I wanted it to go and what I needed to take care of before she came. She assured me that she and I could support him together safely on our own. She had been Shoki's vet for almost 20 years. I trusted her implicitly, and I knew that if she was here, not only would Shoki be okay, but so would I. After I had made the vet appointment, I went back out and told Shoki, through my sobs, that everything was set. Then I asked him to show me where he wanted to be buried. I explained that there were really only 3 options that wouldn't put the gravesite too near a water source or too near the extensive root systems of the big oak trees on my property. I wasn't expecting an immediate answer, but later that day, I noticed Shoki standing directly over one of the spots I had offered him as a possibility. This wasn't a spot where I'd ever seen him standing intentionally like that before, and he was all alone. So I went out and I stood there with him. "Is this the spot?" I asked. He sighed, lowered his head, and licked and chewed. And that's how the gravesite was chosen. A little while later, I looked back outside, and Tempo was standing there in that same spot with Shoki. At that point, there wasn't a doubt in my mind, not only that this was supposed to be the gravesite, but also that Tempo knew what was happening, that she understood the decision Shoki and I had made, and that she was working to make peace with it herself. As it turned out, my neighbor offered to come dig and prepare the gravesite, but he was only available to dig the hole that weekend, and this was a Friday. That meant that the grave would have to sit open for days. At first, I felt a little panicked about this, mostly because I wasn't sure I could handle seeing it out there every day, but also because the spot was inside the back pasture, which meant I'd have to secure it to make sure none of the other horses accidentally fell in. But I really didn't need to worry. As it turned out, Shoki and the other horses seemed really happy to have the time to get to know his gravesite after it was dug. And I kid you not when I tell you that Shoki spent a couple of hours there every single day, and that most of the time, Puck and Tempo were with him. The day before the vet was scheduled to come out, as I was sitting under the run-in with Shoki, Puck and Tempo came over and flanked him from behind. All three horses went into a deep meditative state and stayed that way for a long time. I was sitting in a chair in front of Shoki. He was so relaxed, a couple times I thought he might go down. Silently, I encouraged this. Part of me really wanted him to go out on his own terms. But Shoki continued to fight the urge to lie down. In my own mind, I asked him why. If he was really ready to go, why was he fighting it so hard when all he had to do was just lie down and let go? He was already surrounded by his family. What came to me in response in the silence of that space, with just me and the three longest standing members of my herd in silent meditation together, was perhaps Shoki's most profound wisdom. Our whole life together, his soul whispered to mine, has been a partnership. You've worked hard to keep my body well nourished, even long after my teeth stopped working. You've gone out of your way to keep me moving comfortably, even as my joints have continued to deteriorate. Day in and day out, you've prepared special meals and given me medications to manage my pain. I've accepted and appreciated all of these gifts because I know they were offered in love. Your efforts have allowed us to have much more time together, and we've done so many important things as partners through Unbridled these past few years. I'm grateful you made it possible for us to share our healing gifts together in that way, because we make a great team. If you had not been here for me, I would have passed years ago on my own, naturally. Our partnership is what's kept my body going. Now it needs to be our partnership that lets it go. I can't do this by myself. And this leads us to the third element, a good death, which is the literal meaning of the word euthanasia. When we humans take on the responsibility of serving as the custodians of our equine companions, which includes making day-to-day decisions about their care and intervening as necessary to support their physical, mental, and emotional health, we also take on a responsibility to do everything we reasonably can to facilitate a peaceful and loving end-of-life transition. In most cases, this requires very intentional attention and planning. When we choose not to think or talk about the kind of death we want to facilitate for our horses, we risk undermining, in the end, much of the work we've done to facilitate a good life for them. Without a doubt, the best ending to a good life is a good death. Given the conversations that Shoki and I had in the week leading up to his euthanization, I'm sure it won't surprise you when I say that Shoki was completely calm and willing and cooperative the day of the procedure. This is the only photo I have of the vet and Shoki and me that morning. I'm in the red jacket, and the orange arrow is pointing to where my vet was standing on the opposite side of Shoki. The photo was taken at a great distance, which is why it's fuzzy. It was taken by the one friend I invited to be on site with us and to take photos that day. I had sensed very strongly from Shoki that he wanted me to document this day so that it would be part of the story he already knew I was supposed to tell as part of his legacy. For me, one of the things that allowed me to openly feel a sense of joy around Shoki's passing was that I knew somehow his soul was going to be reunited with the soul of my friend Billy, who died of cancer in 2001. She had rescued Shoki as a young horse and later entrusted me with his care and asked me to watch over him until they could be reunited. I mention this again now because I want to share something truly beautiful that happened during his euthanization. The vet had already administered the sedative, which is the first step and prepares the horse's mind and body to receive the second lethal injection of barbiturates. Shoki was so calm and relaxed, almost asleep after being given the sedative, that my vet said, "I have a feeling he's going to be one of those that just gently buckles and lies down." Of course, she had already prepared me for the other possible involuntary responses horses sometimes have to the lethal injection. So either way, I was ready. About 30 seconds after the barbiturates were injected, Shoki suddenly lifted his head in alertness and looked very intentionally past me, into the distance, off to the left of the screen here. He had his ears pricked forward and a soft, beautiful expression in his eye, as if recognizing an old friend. And I knew Billy had come to meet him. A moment later, he rocked back and rose up on his hind legs as if his very soul was literally leaping out, and then his body fell, lifeless, to the ground. My vet told me later that even though she's helped thousands of horses cross over, she's never seen one perk up and look so purposefully off into the distance like that after being administered the sedative or the barbiturate. Now it's time to talk about the fourth element, honoring our grief. Although this element had actually started a week before, the grief took over as soon as Shoki's body hit the ground. My vet was wonderful. She was a centering force for me in those moments immediately after Shoki went down. She kneeled beside his head and gently rubbed his face, closing his eyes. Lovingly, she thanked him for his friendship. And leading by example, she helped me let go of the hesitation I suddenly felt about touching his body. But when I did, it was soft and warm. I felt what remained of his life force pass through my hands and into my heart. Together, we ceremoniously cut the braids I had lovingly prepared in Shoki's mane, which I knew I wanted to save. And after I had said my goodbyes, it was time to let the other members of the herd say theirs. The weather that day was quite cool, and the herd had been turned out early together, enjoying a final graze and then a playful romp before Shoki eventually made his way, voluntarily, to the gravesite area. Tempo stayed close to him and seemed to know this would be her last opportunity to stand in solidarity with him, which their aligned body positions confirmed. The other 3 horses meandered to the front pasture, which is where I had decided they should be during the euthanization procedure, just to ensure that no one got too curious about the vet's supplies or made the process more complicated than it needed to be. The herd would still be nearby and would be able to watch over the fence if they so chose. Shortly before the vet arrived, I asked Tempo to join the others in the front pasture, which she did willingly. This shot shows where most of the herd chose to be during the procedure. Puck, Tempo, and Rayleigh all stayed within easy eye shot and earshot of what was happening, but they grazed calmly throughout. Marcus, who isn't visible here, chose to stay on the far side of the front pasture, off to the left and behind the cars, completely out of eye shot. I honestly thought that all of my horses, but especially Puck and Tempo, who had never known life here on my farm without Shoki, would have a hard time saying their goodbyes or making sense of his death. I knew for sure that neither of these mares had ever experienced the death of another horse, at least not in person. But I was wrong about how things would play out. Grief is very individual. When I invited the two mares, the two mares approached together, but came only close enough to smell the air that was blowing softly in their direction from Shoki's resting place. As I watched them, it was obvious they had already known he was gone. And upon confirming this for themselves, they simply turned together and walked back into the front pasture to return to grazing. Rayleigh's response was a little different. When I invited him, he approached all the way to Shoki's body with his head high and his own body alert. As he got close, he repeatedly raised and lowered his head, sniffing the air and trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Rayleigh actually walked all the way up to Shoki's body, but intentionally avoided approaching Shoki's head. He walked a wide berth around it before reaching down to sniff Shoki's front feet. Then he promptly shied away before regaining his composure and then rejoining the mares in the front pasture. It turned out to be Marcus, who had the hardest time saying goodbye that day. I had to go and retrieve him from the far front of my property, and I walked beside him all the way to Shoki's body. What transpired from there amazed me. I knelt down beside Shoki's face, and Marcus followed my hand down with his nose and began sniffing Shoki's shoulder. He took several long whiffs as he passed his nose over various parts of Shoki's neck and face. Then he started nibbling, ever so gently, on his dear friend's ears. Of course, Shoki did not respond. At that point, Marcus got a bit agitated and actually started nipping at Shoki's neck as if wanting to egg his friend into getting up and playing the way they used to. It was simultaneously heartwarming and heart-wrenching to watch. When Marcus realized that Shoki was not going to get up, what he did next took my breath away. Marcus lifted his left front foot and gently placed it on Shoki's shoulder, right over the spot where Shoki's heart lay quiet in his chest. And then he stood like a statue in that position for what seemed like an eternity, paying homage to the best friend he'd ever had. When Marcus finally took his leg down, he continued to stand over Shoki's body as you see pictured here on the right, with his eyes mostly closed in deep meditation. After a while, I gently wrapped Shoki's head to keep the flies away. Then I left the two alone together because Marcus clearly wasn't done saying his goodbyes. After about 30 minutes, I felt Marcus beckoning me to come back. I thought maybe he was needing emotional support to walk away, but when I invited him to come with me to join the rest of the herd, he wouldn't budge. And that's when it hit me. Marcus wanted to invite me to stay with him and to connect more deeply with my own grief over the loss of our shared friend. At that moment, I realized how strong I'd been trying to be for everyone else that day, including the horses. Marcus's energy was so grounding. I felt as if he was saying, "Let me hold this sacred space of grief for both of us." And that's how Marcus reminded me that we should never rush through our goodbyes. This incredible horse stood over me and my long-term partner as I fell to the ground, buried my head in Shoki's neck, and sobbed. He continued to stand over me, allowing me to let my guard down and to be as vulnerable as I needed to be in order to say my goodbyes properly. And after sitting there for a long time in that beautiful space of grace, I noticed that the ribbons in Marcus's tail were gently blowing in the breeze. I had braided those ribbons into his tail to give him a longer fly swatter. Marcus came to me with a cropped tail, but that's a whole nother story. In that moment, as I was noticing the ribbons in Marcus's tail, I swear I heard Marcus say, "Shoki wants you to have his tail too." He was proud of it, but he has no more need for it. And then Marcus supervised approvingly as I trimmed and collected Shoki's long tail hairs, placing them in the box with his braided locks of mane. All of this was such a profound gift, none of which I would have done or experienced without Marcus's leadership. That day, he showed me what it means to honor one's grief. He also confirmed what I already know to be true about horses and herd families. The individual who sees and understands what is needed always steps forward to provide it. After that, I was able to stand beside Marcus, a million times lighter than I'd been, and thank him from the bottom of my heart. After which he willingly turned and followed me back out to rejoin the herd. Then my neighbor came and we buried Shoki's body, along with some ceremonial gifts I had chosen to bury with him. That evening, after the horses had eaten dinner and were tucked away in their night paddock, I noticed Tempo standing in the corner closest to the back pasture, staring straight at Shoki's gravesite. She remained there, all alone, quietly looking in the direction of his resting place with a deeply focused but calm attentiveness. I stood there with her until the sun went down on that most profoundly perfect and heartbreaking day. The herd's element of honoring grief did not stop there. In fact, it went on very deliberately for 2 more weeks. My herd typically prefers to spend the majority of their time in the larger front pasture, but they spent most of their time each day for the next 2 weeks in the back pasture where Shoki was buried. They all, individually and collectively, spent quite a bit of time actually facing the gravesite. For some reason, I had a circle around the gravesite, which is where that orange marking is. I'm not sure why it's looking like that right now, but anyway, that's where the gravesite was. And they all individually and collectively spent quite a bit of time facing that area, which was an area of the pasture that had never seemed to hold any special meaning to them previously. For the first few days, I honestly don't think any of my horses lied down to sleep after Shoki was buried. On the 3rd day, they very intentionally took turns sleeping and spent a lot of time huddled much more closely together than is usual for my herd. Initially, none of the horses wanted to approach the gravesite. So on the 4th morning, I invited a friend who is an energy worker to come over. We went out and very intentionally sat on the far side of the gravesite, about where you see Marcus standing in this photo. As soon as my friend started running, clearing energy, each of the horses came over in turn to visit with us and to quietly explore the gravesite at close range. Still, all of them, except Tempo, were very careful not to actually walk across or even step on the areas of the ground that had been involved in the burial. But Tempo, she walked right over it, just once, very slowly, as if wanting to draw what was left of Shoki's energy right into her feet. This photo was taken a little later that day, after we went back inside and I looked out the window. All 4 horses continued to spend time that day immediately around the gravesite, but none of them, not even Tempo, walked over it again. And even today, 7 months later, it's very rare for me to see any of the horses standing or walking over this spot. When they do, it's very slow and intentional, and usually with their noses to the ground. And now I want to talk briefly about the 5th element, rebirth. This element wasn't even on my radar before I went through this shared experience with Shoki and my herd. The death process is not only an opportunity for spiritual rebirth for the one who is transitioning, it also requires those of us who are left behind to reimagine ourselves and our lives without them. If you have ever experienced the loss of a loved one, you already know that nothing, and in many cases, I literally mean nothing, is the same after that person or animal is gone. I knew that the dynamics within my herd would change dramatically when Shoki was gone, and he even did what he could to begin preparing them for the transition before he left. But what was most fascinating to me was that the herd intentionally did not try to sort this out immediately after his death. Instead, what happened is that the second longest standing member of my herd, who also happens to be the only member of my herd who is a mother and who has the embodied experience of a mother's protective energy, immediately stepped into the role of temporary leader of my herd. For the first 2 months after Shoki's death, I saw aspects of Puck's personality I had never seen before. As she stepped willingly into the role of my partner and the right-hand man, so to speak, in helping me manage the day-to-day movements and responsibilities of the herd. She also helped to keep things functioning in the farm and on my business as we moved through this period of mourning. The other 3 horses and I were all deeply grateful for her leadership and afforded her a level of respect and authority she had never commanded before. But Puck is not really invested personally in where she stands in a ranking, nor is she really willing to put forth the effort required to maintain a high position in the resource guarding pecking order of a herd. So about 3 months out from the date of Shoki's death, I came out one morning to find that Rayleigh was suddenly bossing Puck around, much like he had Shoki. And just like Shoki, she was totally letting him do it. Rayleigh may be small in size, but he has big ambitions, and it was clear that he had decided it was time to make his move to capture the top spot in the new resource guarding pecking order of my herd. I was truly intrigued to see how all of this was going to play out. I was pretty confident that Marcus, who is absolutely a lover, not a power player, would remain at the bottom of the proverbial pecking order. And I want to be clear here that leadership in horse herds is not synonymous with pecking order. But what happens is that pecking orders are an often necessary coping strategy for domestic herds because they have to deal with the very unnatural reality of limited resources in captivity. I also want to say that although Marcus has remained at the bottom of the resource guarding pecking order, he now holds the role in our herd of a very stabilizing and grounding energy force, much more so than he ever did while Shoki was living. What I had a hard time imagining was that Tempo, who despite being born into my herd and always carrying the responsibility of being the baby in the past, I had a hard time believing that she would be willing to cede power or control over to Rayleigh, who despite his ambitions is still the youngest member of my herd and also the newest. Well, my instincts were right. Tempo made it very clear she was having none of Rayleigh's power games, and she was quick to show him that she has every intention of honoring her father's legacy by being the one who steps into his place of responsibility for the overall well-being and safety of the herd. While we all still miss and mourn for our beloved friend and mentor, seeing my other horses have the presence and courage to move on and to begin writing the next chapter of our shared story provides a perfect segue into the 6th and final element: legacy. This is all about how we, collectively and individually, choose to carry forward the spirit and energy and love we feel for the one we've lost. This element began while Shoki was still alive, as he and I worked together on the writing of his obituary. Because Shoki was loved by so many involved with my equine-inspired learning business, I knew that I wanted to offer a way for people to make a contribution in his memory. I had a lot of different ideas about great causes we could direct these contributions toward. But when I asked Shoki about it, he was very clear that the legacy he felt proudest of was the way he'd taken care of his herd family. And he wanted to be sure we were the ones who benefited from any support that was given in his name or honor. So that's what I did. And now every day when I do the work of tending to our precious herd, I know he's walking beside me, and I know his legacy lives on in all of us. His legacy also lives on right now here today, as I've shared this final story about his journey. Shoki's legacy is a legacy of love and commitment and pride and friendship and of eternal horse wisdom. May each of you carry some of this wisdom with you today and into your future. Thank you for listening and for allowing me to share this story today. Linda knows, and I told her it's the first time I've told this story publicly, so got emotional a little bit a couple times. But when Linda asked me to share, to present at this conference, as I was thinking about it, I could feel Shoki kind of nudging my shoulder and telling me that it was time, that this was the right time to do it. And after getting to know the community of this conference throughout the week, I understand why this is such an amazing community. So thank you for letting me share his story today.
Oh, thank you, Kim. I'd like to bring everybody back up on video, but only when you're ready, because I'm going to be a minute. So
I'm
yeah.
not the only one? Okay.
You did well. I'm not sure about all of us. Yeah, let's come back up on video. Any questions you have, any comments, anything you'd like to share, come on back up. Only when you're ready. We will take a minute and take a deep breath.
Kim, thank you. That was amazing. I was really looking forward to this one. It might sound weird, but you'll understand when you know that I love the way you said a beautiful story about death and dying. I've been through this loads of times, and each time is different. And I don't know. I was going to say it doesn't get easier, but sometimes there's, like you've just beautifully described, it's as much as a gift as a loss. So just thank you for sharing and with it being so recent, God, I don't think I could have got through that. So well done.
Well, it has been 7 months.
He got you through it.
Yeah, he got me through it, and I got to practice a little. But it is, I'm so thankful that he helped me stay present through this. I've lost other horses. I lost one to a lightning strike years ago. Sudden things. This was the first time that I had gone through euthanization with a horse. So really walking through that in that intentional way where it was a partnership to make the decision. And I'm so thankful it was him, because now I feel like I at least have an understanding of how to stay present through that process with the others. And I know it'll be very different with each one. So I appreciate you telling me that, because I sense that that's true.
Yeah, definitely.
Anybody else? Anybody else like to share?
Kim, yeah, this is, wow, what a gift. Thank you.
I do want to hear your perspective, given the work that you do. Yeah.
I don't know if I could do that right now, but wow. This can be such a gift to so many families going through this. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, if you don't mind us sharing it, if you don't mind me sharing it.
Not at all. I got through it. We might as well share it. And for those, I have also some video from that day.
Yeah.
I decided not to use that for the video because for this story, because I think it just was good to stay in one medium. But I did post yesterday on my YouTube channel just a little bit of video footage of of Marcus saying his goodbyes, which is very. So if anybody would like to see the actual live video of that, it's on my YouTube channel. I can give you the link to that if you'd like to.
Yeah, we'll post that with when we put everything up. I'll add that to it.
Okay.
For sure.
Thank you so much, Kim, for sharing that. In January, the farm I just moved from lost 3 horses. Our senior paddock, but it was just important to me the way they observed what was happening, the reaction to the herds. So thank you for being able to communicate that so beautifully.
Thank you, Eileen. It is so important. I think everyone here, this community probably understands the importance of those goodbyes. But, you know, in the horse industry, there's a lot of, especially at boarding facilities, I think a lot of times because different people own the different horses, and it's just, a lot of times they're taken to a vet clinic. There's just not a chance for horses to say that. And, you know, the relationships they have with each other are no less meaningful and real, probably more so than ours with them. I mean, they live together every day. And it doesn't just affect one, it affects my whole herd. You know, we're still trying to find our new normal without him. You know, just like in a family, if a patriarch in a family dies, everything changes, right? Everybody's relationships change. So we redefine ourselves. But the other thing it's had me thinking a lot about is, you know, horses get sold a lot in the domestic world too. And it's not death, but at least with death, if they get to say goodbye, they understand what's happened. They know that the horse is gone. There was not and I've heard other people say this, none of my horses called. They didn't wonder where he was. There was no sense of, they didn't know what had happened. They completely understood. Versus when a horse is taken away on a trailer, you often get a lot of calling, and they stress because they don't know the answer. But so I think that it deserves a lot more conversation and discussion in the horse industry of how do we facilitate any kind of transitions of horses losing their companions and their friends, whether it's to death or some other way. How do we make that, other than, I think it is important to sit and I talk to my horses about things. I think they understand things. So to them what's happening, but there may be other ways too. So I don't want to end the conference on a low note. So I know that this was sad, but it's also beautiful.
It's so beautiful to hear it so well spoken and beautifully communicated that they are so connected. That's why we are so connected to them. It was just because I've experienced other scenarios more due to injury, you know, not the old age, not an old paddock where they were together, you know, they were all over 30, just so horrible for the humans, but just so beautiful how they just supported each other through it, you know, which helped me. Yeah. So, and just to offer that legacy for them too. But because it is, I think it's something that doesn't get acknowledged for the fear of being too emotional or too something. I don't know, because it was something that not everybody was comfortable with discussing, you know.
Yeah.
For me, it just was such a beautiful thing how they helped each other transition.
They certainly do, and they helped me. I don't know how I would have gotten through it without my herd. I mean, they're the ones that I depended on through that.
Yeah, that was amazing with Marcus. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you see the video?
I don't know.
I thought this was sad. Yeah, the video is like, wow.
I think the still photos were beautiful. The video might have been, you know, for me, certainly.
Yeah.
But beautiful. Very well.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, Kim, I don't know.
Hi, David.
I don't know how you got through that.
Oh, I know.
I'm still choked up, and I kind of experienced some of that long distance. Knowing Marcus a little bit because I worked with him, and even Relly. But I'm going to say this. Horses could probably do that on their own, but you prepared them in such a way, such a beautiful way, that it really helped them make that transition. And of course, they were helping you make that transition as well. But how you shared that today, I don't know. I'm still teary-eyed and stuff like that. I mean, that's so beautiful. And of course, it reminds me of the horses I've lost, and my dog and my wife, and you know, and this has been very helpful to have you present it in such a way, such a beautiful, loving way. So I'm Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you for being here today. David's lives far away from me, but he has done energy work and connection with my horses in many different ways. So he knows them remotely. Thank you, David, for being here.
Yeah, thank you, and nice to meet you, David. Tara?
I just wanted to say thank you to you and your herd, and I just hope that it's coming through without me having to say it, but bless you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank goodness we didn't have our videos on. Can you imagine what it was sound like?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think that's also why I think this format was really good for this kind of a story, because each of you could just be in your own space, and I could be in my space as I was telling it. I think that was important too.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to the one thing when Shoki talked about our life together being a partnership, and that it needed to be a partnership at the end. I think that that's something we all should think about when the time comes. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we always have to help them physically transition. Sometimes they will pass on their own, and that's what they need to be supported in doing. But that's not a time to abandon them or to abandon the partnership. And that's the thing I'm most thankful for, was that, and I stayed present. And it's some of my favorite, they're emotional, I get sad, but they're also some of my favorite memories of our time together, for this last week of our life together, of his life with me.
I think you've changed, you've given anybody that's watching this a new way to think about it. I know, Karen, you're here and you work in that same realm of helping with animals, crossing or passing, but to give us another way of doing it, or to give us new things to think about when it's happening, that's an evolution.
And this is so supportive, because so many times you'll hear about people who let go of their senior horses because they can't face having to go through euthanasia with them. And to see this done so honorably and gracefully and lovingly, and it's a gift. And that's why I was saying this would be wonderful to share with families, with people who need to go through it. And I mean, sometimes they can't even be there with the vet, which is something a doula would also step in and be there with the vet. But this has just been amazing. Thank you.
Yeah. And this will be up to share later, so share amongst everybody and anybody. It does. This is both of you ladies, because you're here, Debbie.
I just wanted to say that I really appreciated the way you narrated that story. It was beautifully written. I think many of us, certainly I can speak for myself, I've lost horses under less than circumstances that I didn't want to. But I think one of the things that it's an example of also is not just about the transition, but you actually provided hospice care for your horse. And I think that that's the other aspect of that. Somebody mentioned many people are not able to afford to retire a horse or look after an older horse. And there is this great need for hospice care of all animals. I mean, you see dogs up for adoption as soon as they're too old, and things like this. But I that was a beautiful example of how to provide hospice care for a horse, really.
Yeah. And you are so right. There's so many senior horses in the world that need a soft landing, because, I mean, that's why Marcus is with me. When he could no longer be a show horse, she didn't really have any use for him. And unfortunately, because he had never lived in a herd, she tried him a couple other places where he got beat up. In fact, the reason he has the cropped tail is they put him out with a bunch of yearlings that were weaned. They thought he could babysit the babies, and even the babies chased him off his food and chewed off his tail. He had no idea how to be a horse. And so when she came to me, he was either going to be put down or I was her last chance, last hope. So I was really invested in trying to make that work for him. But his story is not unique. There's a lot of horses that once they can't be useful in the traditional way, they need a soft landing. Yeah. Or people need to have more examples of how do we continue that relationship in the beautiful senior years. I mean, I think that's really what I would love to see, is people feeling like they're empowered to keep those horses and they don't need to compete with them anymore. Like, this is a whole new chapter of life that's beautiful with the horse. So we need to be telling those stories so people can envision how to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think in, working in the therapeutic setting, it's very much how we treat our horses is how we treat our society at large. And given that the therapeutic work that we do is all about relationship building with the horses, it's like, well, when they get older, are we just going to get rid of them then? Or is that what you do with your elderly parents or your grandparents or whatever?
Yeah.
So, I love the way that you went through all the stages today, Kim, when you were telling us the story, because when you work with clients therapeutically and it's all kind of a family, it's enough going through it yourself, but actually you're responsible for all these vulnerable people as well. You're not responsible for them, but it affects all these vulnerable people. So, we've had quite a few passings at our centre now because horses just don't live as long as we do. And we have to take into account clients that are with us at the time that may have a particularly strong relationship with each other. And we even have to think back, before we put out an obituary on Facebook or whatever, we have to think back to clients that have been with us a few years ago that maybe still would read the Facebook page, and we don't want you to suddenly see it in front of them late at evening. So we kind of have a procedure where we have to contact people. And that varies from if we know in advance that we're going to have to say goodbye to a horse, or if it's a sudden thing. But, what you went through with Shoki, I find it really sort of supportive and strengthening when we lose a horse here. And I'm going through all this stuff, but other people are too. And it's all about feeling the love, isn't it? And how much love there is for these horses. And you mentioned earlier, Kim, about how very often sort of like in the conventional world, that because obviously we're not in the conventional world, we're not in the normal world here, but in the sort of mainstream world, horses just kind of disappear, don't they? Like, don't talk about it very much. I remember when I was a kid growing up, I'd go down to the sort of stables one day and one of the horses would have gone, and oh yeah, okay, it got shot yesterday. But what I found amazing about, like you, having to kind of learn how to go through these processes in the best way, is that it actually gives people a chance to experience it that then helps them in their wider life. So I know that going through losses of my horses helped me when it came to saying goodbye to my dad and my mum.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that hiding things away is the answer, exactly as you sort of said in your beautiful story, Kim. Is actually one of the gifts that the horses give us as they leave us, is preparing us for the other losses as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you brought up a really, really good point about that I almost struggled with. So many people love Shoki, and I knew their hearts were going to be broken. I mean, there were a lot who knew, we had even talked sometimes about, I'm waiting for him to tell me, people would be there on his good days and bad days, but this was my relationship with Shoki was so personally, emotionally for me. And this was my first time going through this, that I actually made an active decision that for that week after I called the vet, I cleared my schedule. And I didn't feel like I didn't want to answer the questions about how do you know it's time? Oh, he looks good today. I knew that it was such a tenuous place for me emotionally that I had to protect that space. And I knew I was going to create a way for them to make a contribution and all of that. But I just had to protect myself and Shoki. I also asked him, did he feel like being visited? And what I was getting back, maybe it was me projecting too, I don't know. But I felt like everything was just saying for us, for this, me and my herd, for that experience, we just needed to cocoon ourselves through the process. And I had to honor that. And that was hard because I knew I was very worried about, I'm like a lot of people, I tend to worry about what everybody else, how's everybody else going to feel when they get this news. But everybody was actually very loving and supportive. They knew that that was a very hard thing for me. I think as I go through it more later in the future and with different horses, I may be able to have a different way of approaching it. But I'd love to hear how you do that, where you manage sharing the news and with people who care about the horse and still being able to
For sure.
have control and the privacy that you need and the horse needs to go through that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, as I said before, go over to our Humanity Needs the Horses page. Anybody's welcome there. It's a private page, but go over, share your thoughts on that. This will be up there by the end of the day. David, yes.
I gotta say, Kim, I really appreciate you doing this, but I want you to know that I really appreciate Shoki doing this with you.
Yeah.
Your connection is beyond the grave, and what you're doing as part of his legacy. Sorry, I'm so emotional. I didn't really get to know Shoki, and I never met him in person, but when I did his portrait, is when I connected with him and realized what an incredible being he was. But this message that you're presenting after his passing is so incredible and so needed. So I want to thank you for doing this. It's got to have been hard, but you did a wonderful job. But Shoki, just tell Shoki that this is really important work that he's doing with you.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And he was here. In fact, I put these are 2 pictures of him back here. They're not usually in here, but I brought them today. Yeah. Thank you, David.
Absolutely. Well said, everybody. I have no words.
I think I just want to add in one thing, and I don't think people are always aware of this, but when we grieve the loss of an animal, it can also bring back things in our past that haven't been fully grieved. So, there can be different layers of grief that come up for us. And so maybe if you're standing with someone who's going through that, maybe just understand that they need to get these different layers out. It may happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Deep breath. Thank you for providing a soft landing for the whole conference. I'm sorry, I'm really emotional. I will sum up my words later in a video.
Yep.
But thank you, Kim. And thank you all for holding the space for Shoki and Kim to do this and to share this. Such an important message, as all of these messages have been in the last 5 days. So with that, I will say goodbye and fall apart. So
Thank you,
everybody. Thank you,
hug.
Kim.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you.
And thank you
Post
all
to
for being
everybody.
here.
Linda, big hug
What
to
a
you.
privilege.
Thank you. All right, Kim, stay put. Don't go to her. Good night, everybody.
Good night.